Hi folks, welcome to another video, and in this video we'll be talking about a different part of the war, a part that doesn't get as much attention as I think it should. It doesn't get as much attention as things going on back east, things we've already talked about around the two nations' capitals, Washington, D.C. and Richmond. See, we mentioned before that when Winfield Scott was creating that so-called Anaconda Plan that would be designed to squeeze the South into submission, he knew that battles fought in what we now call the Western theater of the Civil War would be crucial. Battles fought in the Mississippi River area, places like Tennessee, Mississippi, Arkansas. They're not as famous today. They weren't even as famous in the 1860s. The newspapers tend to pay more attention to things that were going on in the East, around the capitals, around the major population centers. Strategically, though, to really understand the war and to get an early dose of the action in the early battles of the war, you have to go out west. You have to go out to the Mississippi River Valley. Well, as you guys know, there isn't a lot going on back east after the First Battle of Bull Run, not at the end of 1861. Remember, the Union had just appointed George McClellan as the commander of the Union Army of the Potomac, and he's not really action-oriented. He wasn't doing much. He was taking his time. He said he would be fine. He could do everything when he got the chance, when he was ready. It just, is he ever going to be ready? Well, while we're waiting for McClellan to decide whether he's going to be ready to move or not back east, I thought we should spend a little time looking at what's going on in the Western theater of the Civil War from the end of 1861 to early 1862. And to do that, I want to look at a map with you that may surprise you, because the states on the map you're looking at aren't usually considered part of the West today. Well, in the 1860s, this was about as far west as most Americans had fully settled. There was a lot of sporadically settled territory farther west than this, but this was considered the West in the 1860s. And if you look on this map, you can see there's the Mississippi River running right through this area. And there's a lot of action out there, especially in Tennessee in the early stages of the war. So this is where I wanted to spend some time with you in this video, things that we can discuss as we go. And to do this, we need to introduce some people. Now, I'll tell you right now, I've already said, now that we're in the war and we're looking at the battles, it's really not fair for me to expect you to be experts in every single battle, every single officer's name. There's a lot of people, there's a lot of things going on in the military history of the Civil War. So, don't stress yourself out too much. I want to introduce some people to you, though, to illustrate some bigger points. When the war began and the South seceded and formed the Confederacy, most of the generals, most of the officers with combat experience who were considered really good tacticians, really good strategists in the United States military, joined the South. They seceded with the southern states because they were mostly southern natives. It was going to be really tricky for Abraham Lincoln to find really skilled generals to command the Union Army at the beginning of the war. So to prove this point, let me introduce you to a handful of northern officers. The first two, I'm willing to bet you've never heard of. Chances are the two names on your screen right now, Henry Halleck and Don Carlos Buell, are totally unfamiliar to you. And that's totally fine. That's understandable. I would be surprised if you're watching this and thinking, oh yeah, Halleck and Buell, I know those guys. But what you're looking at were the two generals whose job was to command all troop movements and all strategy in the Western theater of the war at the beginning of the Civil War. You probably never heard of them. That's okay. We're not going to worry too much about who was in charge of what portions of the West. That's not my goal here. I just wanted to introduce you to them. So the first guy we've got to deal with is Henry Halleck. His men called him Old Brains as a nickname, which is not very flattering. You look at this guy, and I don't know if you see what I see. I see someone who's a little reticent. He looks a little awkward in front of the camera. Frankly, I don't know if you've ever seen those old Looney Tunes cartoons with Bugs Bunny, Daffy Duck. I don't know, does this guy look like Elmer Fudd, that hunter, to you a little bit? That's how I see him. Henry Halleck was a brilliant guy. That's why they called him Old Brains. But he was crabby. He was not very innovative. He tended to, sometimes even when he was trying to decide strategy for the armies, he would go back to his old manuals from West Point Military Academy and refer to those. He's not really one to think on his feet. And he's also, how should I put it? He wants attention. He's the kind of guy who wants glory for himself. I don't know if you've ever had a job where your boss took credit for something that you did. Henry Halleck is pretty much seen today as a smart guy who really wasn't cut out for field command of an army. But right now, he had a lot of people under his command out west, some of whom are going to be more famous than him before too long. So let's take a look at the other guy who's out there out west who you probably never heard of. Don Carlos Buell a little more of a traditional officer for the Civil War because he's got a big beard. Everybody in the Civil War had crazy beards. Buell was, again, a smart guy. You don't rise to the rank of general in the U.S. Army without being pretty intelligent. But he also was known as being strictly focused on order, routine, tradition, following procedure and ritual. There's a story that Buell was watching some enlisted men under his command practice shooting at targets with their guns at the beginning of the war. And he came upon a private who was a crack shot, who was hitting every target, no matter how far away his friends put the target. And rather than praise this young man for being such a great shot with his gun, Buell got off his horse and started just scolding him and just chewing him out because the top few buttons on his jacket were undone. That's the kind of guy Buell was. And these two men couldn't stand each other. They're bickering. They're, glory hogs. And they had political appointments that told them, do what you need to do, but don't be too aggressive. Because remember, Abraham Lincoln was telling his officers at the beginning of the war, this is not a war against slavery. This is a war to preserve the Union, to put down this rebellion. So these generals out west are trying to beat the Confederate armies in the field, while they're also dealing with the fact that there were other people in the North who thought this should be a war against slavery, and they're being told, no, not to deal with that. All right, so these two men you probably never heard of, understandable. Now, I want to introduce you to two other Union officers, and you might be a little more familiar with at least one or two of these names, because Sherman and Grant are going to be, it's not a spoiler, you're probably familiar with at least one of these guys' names. Sherman and Grant are going to be pretty darn famous by the end of the war. They're still pretty famous today. Interestingly, though, at the beginning of the Civil War, they were both stationed out west, and they had to answer to the two generals that you never heard of before, Henry Halleck and Don Carlos Buell. But let's introduce ourselves to these two men real quick. So here's William Tecumseh Sherman. We're going to see a lot of this guy during the war. I don't know if you see what I see when I look at Sherman. This guy's pretty tough. He's not going to take anything from anybody. He looks like he punch you and a smile at you. And the thing about Sherman that always strikes me when you look at the beginning of the Civil War is he was listening to all these other politicians and officers and civilians after Fort Sumter was fired on, saying, oh, this is going to be a real short war, one big battle, 3-month enlistments, things like that. Sherman told anyone who would listen to him, this war would last much longer than we expected. His brother was a United States Senator from Ohio. And Sherman wrote to his brother right at the beginning of the war, said, trying to stop this rebellion with 3-month volunteers. How did he put it? He said it was like trying to put out the flames of a burning house with a squirt gun. It won't be enough. This is going to be a much longer, more brutal war than anyone realizes. That's Sherman's approach. And frankly, Don Carlos Buell, who was Sherman's superior officer at the beginning of the war, thought that this meant that Sherman was insane. He said all this talk of a long, nasty war was evidence of insanity on Sherman's part. People thought he was nuts. Of course, he turned out to be right. And we'll see more of him. And then there's this guy, who I'm assuming some of you have heard of before. Ulysses S. Grant. What do you say about him? He's tough. He's everything George McClellan would turn out not to be. He's aggressive. He could be vicious. He's not going to win himself a lot of friends in the northern newspapers and northern politicians because they think he's almost too aggressive, savage. He's called things like this. But these are the two men who are going to rise to the top of the Union command eventually. I don't think it's a spoiler to tell you that. The thing about Grant is, we have to acknowledge this. I'm not trying to pick on Grant. His enemies, and he had several enemies in the North who thought he was too rough of a commander, who thought he was heartless almost, accused him of being a drunk. They accused him of crawling into a whiskey bottle, so to speak, whenever a campaign stalled out, whenever things were not going according to plan. And I'll be honest with you, there's some evidence to suggest that. He's not without his flaws, and we'll see that as we go. These two men are under the command of Buell and Halleck at the beginning of the war. And all of them, Halleck, Buell, Sherman, Grant, all the other officers out in the West, are getting a lot of pressure from Abraham Lincoln to fight the rebels in battle. And it's because George McClellan back in Washington, D.C. wasn't doing a thing. He took his men, he was training them, he kept saying to Abraham Lincoln, we're not ready, you're not giving me enough support, blah, blah, blah. And the men out west are being told, you have to go fight. They're being pressured, understandably, to get some action because the public is waiting to see how this war is going to turn out. Now, it's not totally fair, it's not totally balanced, I've been accused of bias here. I just introduced you to 4 Union officers. And I'm about to introduce you to one Confederate general who'll be involved in the story out west at the beginning of the war. It's not because I'm pro-Northern or anti-Southern. I wanted you to see these men from the North because the fact was Halleck and Buell illustrate the sort of, how should I put it, inadequate officers that Lincoln had to deal with at the start of the war. The Confederates didn't have to deal with that as much. And so I want to introduce you to the Confederate general who was going to be leading the charge to defend the Western Theater against these Yankee invaders at the beginning of the war. You may remember previously we've talked about a Confederate general named Joseph Johnston. And I apologized at the time. I said, look, I know there are sometimes people in history with the same last name. It gets confusing. There's two Confederate generals named Johnston. I'm sorry, okay? Maybe you remember, though, and I tried not to spoil it, I said that after a while, we only have to worry about one Confederate general named Johnston. We'll see why soon, all right? Albert Sidney Johnston really was one of the highest ranking generals in the entire Southern Army. In the entire Western Theater, nobody outranked him. He was controlling the strategy to defend states like Mississippi, Tennessee, and Arkansas from the Union Army. And he had a great track record. He had fought in the Mexican War. He had friends in high places. Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president, said this about Johnston. Albert Johnston was called the greatest soldier then living, looking back at the beginning of the Civil War. Even Union officers, when they were about to fight against A.S. Johnston, as he was called for short, sometimes got a little timid because they realized what a strong reputation Johnston had and what a brilliant strategist he was. All of these men are going to face off in the West, and they're all commanding thousands and thousands of troops trying to control this region. Johnston's trying to defend it from these Yankee invaders, and of course the Union officers are trying to control the Mississippi River Valley for reasons that we've talked about. Now, as we look at any campaign in the Civil War, as we've already done and as we'll continue to do. Again, I got to put your mind to these. I am not asking you to be experts on the military history of the Civil War. We'll talk about some battles. I think they're fun to talk about. They're exciting, they're interesting, they're tragic, they're dramatic, they're emotional. History is about emotion just as much as it is about memorization. I don't want you to memorize every little detail about every battle. I've said that before. I'll continue to remind you, okay? But where we start the situation, end of 1861, early 1862 in the Western Theater. You want to look into southern Illinois, western Kentucky, places like that. And Albert Sidney Johnston and the entire Confederate Army were moving up through Tennessee, trying to defend this entire western part of Tennessee and Kentucky from the encroaching Union forces under people like Ulysses S. Grant. They had their entire army spread out almost throughout this entire corner of Tennessee. Now, what you've got, you can't see on this map, because remember, transportation is key. Scott's Anaconda Plan was all about cutting off the ability of the Confederates to transport things and people and supplies. One of the strategies was about controlling rivers in enemy territory. You can't see on this map, but there were two rivers that ran through western Tennessee that connected to the Mississippi. And the Confederates realized at the end of 1861 how crucial it would be to hold on to those rivers. So really hastily, really quickly, the rebels built two forts that you can see up in northern Tennessee, Fort Henry and Fort Donelson. And they were built pretty quickly. I don't know if you remember the story of the Three Little Pigs, where they built things out of straw and then sticks and then brick, right? Brick was the most durable. These Confederates have very limited resources, not much supplies. Fort Henry, just for example, was mostly built out of bales of hay. You can't make this stuff up. But these poor guys are building with what they had, and they're trying to build these forts to defend these rivers from the Union. So Ulysses S. Grant was given the task of launching a field assault on these forts. Now, what's different about Grant is he wasn't like a lot of other Union generals at the beginning of the Civil War. He wasn't necessarily focused on his own glory and getting his name in the newspapers. He wasn't about getting all of the attention for himself. If you're going to take a Confederate fort that's on a river, Grant was smart enough to realize you can't just attack that fort with infantry. I don't know if you know what infantry means. Infantry means foot soldiers, ground troops. Literally, if a fort's on a river, ground troops are only going to do you any good on the ground side of the fort. They can't walk on water. So what do you need to attack a fort? You need infantry, and you need the Navy. Grant was willing to put his ego aside. There were a lot of other officers then and now who aren't necessarily willing to work with other branches of the armed services in coordinated attacks. Grant didn't care about who got the attention for this or who got the glory. He said, we have to work with the Navy to go after these forts. We have to coordinate this with some naval gunboats that we need to bring onto these rivers. Now, Grant put this plan before his commander, Henry Halleck. And I don't care if you know this, but I just want to use it as an illustration of how petty these two guys could be, Halleck and Buell. I told you it didn't matter, and it doesn't. I just wanted to show you this point. This whole area of Tennessee, western Tennessee, was supposed to be under Don Carlos Buell's control. He was supposed to be in charge of any plan to take Confederate positions in western Tennessee. When Henry Halleck heard from General Grant that he could take this fort with a combined assault of Army and Navy, Halleck secretly sent a message to his friend George McClellan in Washington, who was now the general-in-chief of the whole Union Army, and secretly got command of western Tennessee, switched from Buell to himself, switched to Halleck, so that Halleck could get the glory if Grant's plan worked. This is the kind of petty stuff that could slow down the progress of the Army. So, okay, Halleck says, I've got control of western Tennessee. I'm in charge of what goes on there. Grant, you go for it. You take those ships. You take those ground troops. You take out Fort Donelson. You take out Fort Henry, and good luck to you. So, remember I mentioned that Fort Henry was pretty much built of bales of hay? You can kind of see. It looks like just piles of dirt and grass in this fort. So, it's crazy. Sometimes history depends on factors outside of human control. And if you've ever had a trip coming up and you want to leave at a certain time and the weather gets nasty and it delays your plans, you're upset, but you can't do anything about it. You can't help it if it's raining or snowing or whatever. Well, Fort Henry, sitting on this river, and the weather in early 1862 was going to have a big effect on Grant's plan to take this fort. It's late January, early February 1862. It's in Tennessee. It hasn't been snowing. It's been raining really, really heavily. What's heavy rain going to do to a river's water level? It's going to make the water level rise and rise and rise, right? Check this out. Ulysses S. Grant, working with the Army and the Navy combined, started steaming up this river with some gunboats, what we call ironclads. Ironclad ships are going to be a new thing in the Civil War that both navies would use against each other. The name's kind of self-explanatory. You take an old wooden ship and you clad it or coat it in sheets of iron to better repel bullets and cannonballs. And so Grant is taking these ironclads upriver to try to go at Fort Henry. And if the rain hadn't been as heavy as it was, Fort Henry might not have fallen to Grant. But the rain was really heavy and the water level had risen. And what's crazy is, as Grant and the Navy and the Army were steaming upriver in these boats, as they got closer to Fort Henry, they looked down in the water and they saw these weird little metal balls that were chained to the riverbed. Literally like, rope that they were floating in the bottom of the river. And it had rained so much that the Union ships were just sort of going right over top of these balls. They weren't even touching them because the water level was so much higher. Those were pressure-sensitive mines that the Confederates had put in the water. The original plan was, if the ships come upriver to go after Fort Henry and they touch these mines, boom, they blow out of the water. Grant and the men got lucky. It had been raining so heavily, they just went right past these. Although Grant, being Grant, was always so aggressive to try to, get into the enemy's mind to see how they thought. He actually ordered some poor sailor on one of these ironclad gunboats to dive down into the river at one point, cut loose one of these mines and bring it on the deck just to see what it was like and how it operated. Grant walked up to one of these mines and started tapping on it to see what would happen. It turned out to be a dud. Luckily, all it did was hiss when he tapped it. When it hissed, almost everybody else on the ship just dove into the water to get out of the way. I was like, oh, that's interesting. I mean, that's Grant in a nutshell. He's not afraid of anything. It's crazy. But they were able to go right over top of these mines, and the Confederates inside Fort Henry are like, oh my God, the mines didn't stop them. We don't stand a chance. They've got gunboats. We have bales of hay. So the Confederate soldiers just bolted at the beginning of February. They randomly selected 56 poor guys in the Confederate Army to stay behind them Fort Henry. And their whole job was to just not die, to hold off Grant and the men as long as they could, so that the rest of the men inside Fort Henry could get over to Fort Donelson and reinforce that fort to maybe have a stand against Grant there. So these poor 56 guys inside Fort Henry are like, this sucks, oh my God. Grant decides he's going to open fire on the fort. Think how long you would have held out before surrendering if you were one of these 56 men inside Fort Henry. When Grant attacked, The 56 men inside the fort were ordered to hold out as long as they could. The fact that they surrendered only 3 hours later isn't that bad. Honestly, I'm surprised they waited that long, because Grant had all these ships, and he had the infantry and artillery, which are cannons, all pointed at Fort Henry, and the poor men inside are like, yeah, we give up after just 3 hours. Now, Grant thought, this is great. You know, he could get pretty cocky. He could think, man, this is pretty easy. He actually sent a message to General Halleck, said, well, I took Fort Henry on the 6th. I'm moving on Fort Donelson on the 7th, and you'll expect to hear from me on the 8th with the fort surrendered. He was kind of cocky. It wasn't going to work out that easily, because Fort Donelson was sturdier. Fort Donelson was more reinforced. The men who had gotten out of Fort Henry and gotten to Fort Donelson made sure that there was plenty of men in the Confederate Army inside this fort. When Grant and his ships got there, and you can see these ironclads, see how the slopes are or the sides are kind of sloped to repel any cannonballs? When Grant and these ironclad ships got to Fort Donelson, they didn't find just 56 men inside. They found 17,500 Confederate troops ready for a fight. And when Grant attacked, it was not cake. It was not easy. For 3 brutal days, the rebels gave as good as they got. And they held out, and they held out. Till after a while, even they had to realize it wasn't going to go their way. And it's hilarious. There were 4 Confederate generals inside Fort Donelson. Being good Southern gentlemen, none of them wanted to lose their honor by having to surrender to General Grant. So they literally sat around the table inside Fort Donelson, and they drew straws. And a Confederate general, whose name you don't need to know, but his name's kind of fun, Simon Bolivar Buckner, drew the short straw. And Buckner actually says, oh, this is all right, this is fine, because there's all these crazy connections in the Civil War. Buckner and Grant were old friends. They used to hang out together when they were on leave. I forget how much money it was, but Grant owed Buckner money from before the war. Buckner loaned Grant some cash when he was down on his luck. So Buckner says, it's okay, I drew the short straw, it's good. Grant and I go way back. He owes me money. Maybe he feels bad about that. So I'll go ahead. I'll surrender the Grant. And Buckner expected what you call generous terms of surrender from the enemy. You know, usually if you give the enemy generous terms of surrender, you let them come out. You sometimes would just let them go as long as you took the fort. So Buckner goes to talk to Grant, and he says, hey, pal, how you doing? Remember that money you owe me? And Grant's like, shut up. That's not what I'm here to talk about. Now, when Buckner offered to surrender the Grant wasn't going to go easy on his old friend. He said, no terms except unconditional and immediate surrender will be accepted. If you don't surrender unconditionally, I'll attack you again. Unconditional surrender means you give up the fort and I take you prisoner. And then what they would sometimes do, and this may seem crazy to you today, is they would have the men sign what was called a parole agreement, where they couldn't necessarily afford to feed you as a prisoner, but if you signed a parole agreement, you promised never to take up arms against the Union Army again, and you just got to go home. So this is the terms of surrender that Grant's trying to offer to Fort Donelson. And honestly, there's barely anything going on back east. When Grant has captured Fort Henry and Fort Donelson in the span of about a week and a half, the northern press is like, oh my God, this guy's great. Ulysses S. Grant, U.S. Grant. They started calling him Unconditional Surrender Grant. It's got a nice ring to it. But get this. Grant says, all right, man, let's keep this momentum going. I got Fort Henry. I got Fort Donelson. We want to move towards the Mississippi. Let's take Nashville, Tennessee. Grant sent a request to his superior officer, General Henry Halleck. He said, General Halleck, do I have your permission to take my men and attack Nashville? Get this. Halleck said, nope, sorry, you can't do it. And while we're at it, I want you out of the field for a little while. People couldn't believe this. Their minds were blown. Think about this. What reason could Henry Halleck possibly have for refusing Grant's request? Well, remember, the newspapers were talking about unconditional surrender Grant after Fort Donelson and Fort Henry. They weren't talking about Henry Halleck's bold plan or Halleck giving Grant approval to take these forts. They were talking about Grant. They were praising Grant as a hero. You know what Henry Halleck's worried about? If Grant takes Nashville just as easily as he took those other 2 forts, he's going to get promoted over me. I'm going to lose any chance of glory. He was worried that Grant was going to outshine him, so he refused Grant's request to take Nashville, even though I think Grant could have done it like that. He slowed down the Union war effort in the West because he was worried about losing attention from the newspapers. Well, I don't know if you remember, there were 2 bickering commanding generals in the West. There was Henry Halleck, and there was Don Carlos Buell. As soon as Buell heard that Halleck wasn't going to let Grant take Nashville, guess what Buell says? Heck, I'll take it. So Buell takes his men. But this is the kind of petty crap you've got going on among the Union high command at the beginning of the war. Buell's like, well, I'll take it then. Allen's like, no, you can't. Too bad, I'm going. They couldn't even coordinate this because they were busy about who was going to get all the attention and all the glory. So when Buell was approaching Nashville with his men, there's something that's going to happen frequently in the war. And I want to mention this to you. Albert Johnston had most of his Confederate troops in Nashville, Tennessee, as Buell's army was approaching. Johnston took his troops out of Nashville, not because he was a coward, not because he didn't think he could beat Buell in a head-to-head battle. Think about what would happen to the city of Nashville if there was a battle in town. The town would be destroyed. Buildings would be blown to bits. Civilians would be killed. So Johnston was looking out for the city and for the civilians. And this is going to happen over and over again, especially Southern officers would pull out of a city rather than fight inside the city itself. And so Don Carlos Buell and his men just walked into Nashville. Nashville ended up being controlled by the Union Army for the entire rest of the Civil War. Buell wrote a message to General McClellan and Abraham Lincoln back east talking about the great conquest of Nashville. He didn't have to conquer Nashville. He walked into it. Johnston pulled out so he could regroup his men somewhere outside of town to fight another day. And by this point, Johnston had reinforcements. I don't know if you remember Pierre Beauregard. Beauregard was the one who had given the order to open fire on Fort Sumter back in April of 1861. Beauregard was one of the Confederate generals at the First Battle of Bull Run that previous summer over in Virginia. And now Beauregard's brought some men to reinforce Johnston out west, mostly because not much is going on back east, and they got to move the men where they're needed. So Johnston and Beauregard pulled their combined forces south of Tennessee. Corinth, Mississippi is a town just barely south of the Mississippi state line. Like it's practically in Tennessee. So they pulled down to that city to regroup, to get more supplies, to await a chance to get back into Tennessee and to try to attack the Union again. And they're trying to do things strategically beyond just going back into Tennessee. I just want to mention a battle real quick, not because I think it's crucial to the overall war, but because it gives us a chance to mention a few side things going on in the war. I don't know if you're a United States geography expert or anything, right? But if you picture a map of the U.S. in your mind, or, I don't know, pause the video and Google one if you want to, right next to Tennessee, you've got the state of Arkansas off to the west, right? The state of Arkansas is to the west of the states of Mississippi and Tennessee. And Johnston had a whole plan of how they were going to go about getting at the Union Army. While Johnston and Beauregard were sitting in Corinth, Mississippi, waiting to come back at Grant's army up in Tennessee, Johnston ordered another Confederate general to take a smaller army to go through the state of Arkansas and to come back around into Tennessee from the north to get Grant from behind. And the plan was they were going to squeeze Grant together like this. Well, this army under a Confederate general with a great name, Earl Van Dorn, I don't care if you know who he was, but Earl Van Dorn is a really cool Southern name. I just had to mention that. All right, so General Van Dorn is trying to cut through Arkansas, right? Well, there were Union forces all over the country, and he's not going to even get through Arkansas. But I'm mentioning this battle at Pea Ridge, not because I care if you know what happened at Pea Ridge, but I want to mention two things I think are kind of interesting. Under General Van Dorn's command were about 3,000 soldiers, 3 regiments made up almost entirely of Cherokee Indians. And I don't know if you know your other United States history from, say, before the Civil War. Can you think of any reason why the Cherokee Indians might want to fight against the government of the United States of America? You ever heard of a little thing called the Trail of Tears? The forced march of Cherokee Indians from their ancestral homeland in Georgia out to what's now Oklahoma at a huge expense of human life. There were a lot of Native Americans who fought for the Confederacy during the war because they wanted to take out the United States government. So Van Dorn's got Indians fighting with them. He's got rebel soldiers. They're trying to come around through Tennessee. They got stopped at a place called Pea Ridge in Arkansas. And that's the other thing I wanted to mention because it matters in a lot of other battles. This is the first chance we've had to really see it in action. The armies didn't just march in one big mass in the Civil War. They had scouts, or what they sometimes call pickets, where there were small contingents of soldiers stationed several miles. Look at that. Okay, that's funny. Sorry about that little slip up. I get excited when I talk about the Civil War. I knocked the webcam off the computer. Anyway, sorry about that. Okay, so what I was mentioning was that both armies have what they call pickets or scouts that were stationed several miles ahead of either army. And their job was to be sort of the first line of defense, or the first, feelers to see when the enemies were moving. And as Van Dorn was trying to move his men through Arkansas, around a place called Pea Ridge, Union scouts sniffed out this move. They realized what was going on, and they got the closest collection of Union soldiers in Arkansas rallied together and engaged Van Dorn's men at Pea Ridge and beat them. And it happened again. I think I got it fixed. All right. So anyway, you guys are like, what? Pea Ridge? What? And the webcam keeps breaking. Okay. So Pea Ridge was a Confederate defeat. That's what I'm getting at. All right. And that the fact that they couldn't come through Arkansas and come down and attack Grant from the north really made Johnston have to reevaluate his options. If you can't squeeze the Union Army in Tennessee from both sides, Johnston had to make sure he was strong, and he was going to now be the one to have to come up through Tennessee and attack Grant's army. And so all the attention is going to focus on what Albert Sidney Johnston and the Confederates in northern Mississippi and southern Tennessee can do. And so here's where we stand. I don't know, let's look at this map. So there's Arkansas, right? There's Van Dorn had tried to come through Arkansas to come up through the north through Tennessee, stalled out. So there's Corinth. You see Corinth right at the top of Mississippi, right? So Grant's back in the field because Halleck says, well, I guess I need to let you command the army so Buell doesn't get all the glory. But Buell was willing to put all these differences aside. Buell was sitting in Nashville. You see there's Nashville. Grant's army sitting in western Tennessee. Buell says, we need to hook up. We need to have one combined force here so that we can really be strong against Johnston's rebel army. The thing about Buell is he's slow as heck. Buell is going to take his sweet time getting from Nashville down to where Grant's men were stationed in southern Tennessee. In that time, Albert Johnston realized that Grant was not as strong as he's going to be when Buell gets there. So Johnston says, let's get up in Tennessee. Let's fight those Yankees now. And there's a little town in southern Tennessee, about where this big explosion is that the curse was pointing to, called Pittsburgh Landing, Tennessee. Now we know it as the Battle of Shiloh, because there's a church called Shiloh right near this town, right? They moved up there, and they're going to attack Grant before Grant even knew what was happening. And they're going to attack Grant before Buell can get there. The plan was to get up there quickly. The plan was to get there before Grant's even going to be ready. And they almost blew it, because as Beauregard and Johnston's men were marching from Corinth up into Tennessee, these guys lost a little of their discipline. It was raining, so they wanted to make sure their rifles still worked. So how do you make sure your gun works? You shoot it. Beauregard kept saying to the men, stop shooting the guns. And the men are like, we want to make sure that our guns work after the rain. So some Union generals heard this. They sort of knew that the rebels were coming. Grant didn't know. And this is where it gets controversial. I don't know if you remember what I said Grant was sometimes accused of doing when things slowed down, when there wasn't a lot of action. There are some accusations that Grant was sitting in Pittsburgh Landing drinking himself into a stupor. And whether that's true or not, he was not as necessarily alert as the rest of some of his officers were to what was coming. And he wasn't necessarily alert to the fact that Buell himself was taking his sweet time getting down from Nashville. Abraham Lincoln once said that Buell was cursed with a case of the slows. So Buell's not there yet. Grant's not really ready. Johnston looks like he's got this great chance to strike at these Yankees in Tennessee and win a battle. The battle that's coming up in April of 1862 was hands down the worst battle of the early war. It makes the first Battle of Bull Run look like a skirmish, look like a baseball game. Okay, that's a little harsh because men died at Bull Run. But Shiloh is horrifying, just horrifying. And the fact is, guys, Grant wasn't prepared. Most of the men under Grant's command didn't think there was going to be a battle on the 6th of April in 1862 because Grant hadn't given them any notice. Most Union soldiers were sitting around in their camps playing cards, drinking coffee, when all of a sudden they heard the rebel yell streaming out of the forest all around them. Remember the rebel yell, I won't do it again. So these men were sitting around card tables, eating coffee, eating snacks, drinking coffee, and they freaked out to see thousands of rebel soldiers come pouring out of the woods. A few Union officers took the initiative. Grant wasn't even there yet. Grant had to race to the field from his headquarters when he realized that his men were under attack. William Tecumseh Sherman was there. He ended up being the highest-ranking field officer for the first couple hours of the battle. And there was another general in the Union Army whose name I don't care if you know. His name was Benjamin Prentiss. I'll mention him just because he's going to do something in a second. And that's all you guys need to know about. These men tried to rally their troops and repel this attack from a Confederate force that was out for blood. The Confederates were pushing the Union back all day long. It was brutal. Remember, the Union wasn't as strong as it could have been because Buell's men hadn't gotten there yet, right? But every now and then, in one of these battles, something happens to turn the tide. Remember, I mentioned Albert Sidney Johnston, one of the highest-ranking Confederate generals in the war. Jefferson Davis thought he was a fantastic commander. He's got all his strategy laid out. He looks like he's got the upper hand in this battle at Shiloh. As Johnston was on horseback, rallying his troops to keep pressing their advantage against these Yankees, he felt something at his ankle, like a bee sting almost. He looked down, and there was a little hole in his boot, and it looked like a bullet had just grazed his boot. So he looked down and he laughed. He actually laughed out loud. He said, well, it'll take more than that to trip me up. What he didn't know was that bullet had not grazed his boot. It had gone right into his boot, right in the top of his foot below his ankle. And he laughed and said, oh, they won't trip me up. Within minutes, he was dead because this bullet caused him, it severed an artery and veins in his foot, caused him to bleed out like that. There was only one general in the entire Confederate Army who outranked Albert Sidney Johnston, and that was a guy you may have heard of named Robert E. Lee. But now the South is in disarray because they've lost their commander. Poor Pierre Beauregard had to take control of the Confederate Army in this battle. So that's one of those things that turned the tide. I mean, the Confederates out west lost a strong general really early in the war. If you never heard of Albert Johnston, it's probably because he died so soon in the war. Remember I said we only have to worry about one Johnston from here on out. Albert's dead. Poor guy. Joe Johnston's going to survive. We'll see him more. Anyway, back to Shiloh. Here's the deal. When Beauregard took over, he still got the advantage. He's upset that Johnston's dead, but you can't stop a battle in the midst of tragedy like this. Men are dying all around him. And the thickest fighting at Shiloh was at a spot that historians and even veterans called the Hornet's Nest, at the battlefield at Shiloh. I mentioned this Benjamin Prentice guy, a general in the Union Army. I said you didn't need to know him beyond right now, but I wanted to mention him because he did something that was praised on both sides of the fight for its bravery. Prentice had a very small force under his command at this spot called the Hornet's Nest. You can see the odds right there, 18,000 Confederate troops attacking 4,500 Yankees. It's a massive odds. It's 4-to-1 odds in favor of the Confederates. Prentice held his men in that spot, refused to retreat. They held on all day. They call it the Hornet's Nest because there were so many bullets flying back and forth between the armies that it sounded like hornets buzzing past your head. Prentice held on at this Hornet's Nest. And it was crucial because by the time the sun went down, Buell showed up with thousands of reinforcements. Thing is, in most battles, Shiloh is no different. When the sun went down, most of the time you stop fighting. I don't think I need to ask you why. You can't see anything, right? So, you've got Union reinforcements there, and then the sun goes down. Beauregard, though, the Confederate general in command now that Albert Johnston was dead, was cocky as heck. He actually sent a message to Jefferson Davis back in Richmond that night, talking about this great victory for the Confederates, and all he would have to do was mop up the next day. Ask yourself how Ulysses S. Grant felt being caught by surprise on April 6th. Whether he was drunk or not is up for debate by historians, but he certainly wasn't going to let Beauregard just mop up the next day. Beauregard woke up on April 7th thinking, okay, it's all over, we'll just mop up and then the Yankees will retreat and yay, we're going to win. When Beauregard woke up, there's Beauregard on your left, Grant on your right. He was shocked to see the full Union Army reinforced by Buell's men who had arrived the night before, and Grant didn't wait to be attacked. Grant attacked Beauregard first thing that morning. The Confederates were shocked. They weren't ready. They launched into a full retreat by that afternoon. Grant was trying to hold on to his reputation. He didn't want people to know he'd been taken by surprise, and he made up for it on the second day. But the reason I'm mentioning Shiloh, guys, I want you to soak up some of the impact of this. I don't know if you know much about American history before the Civil War. It's okay if you don't. But I want you to think for a second if you know 3 major wars that the United States fought before the Civil War. I'll help you out. We talked about the Mexican-American War here in the 1840s. There's one. Maybe you've heard of something called the War of 1812. There's 2. And then, of course, there's the American Revolution. Here's what's amazing about Shiloh. This blows my mind. The casualties at Shiloh were so steep. You could take the number of Americans killed in the American Revolution the War of 1812, and the Mexican War, combine them. And there were more Americans killed in 2 days at Shiloh in April of 1862. And there will be battles in the Civil War to come that are more devastating than this. And don't forget, North, South, they're all Americans. So every death in the Civil War counts as an American death. Now, the other thing you need to know when we talk casualties in the Civil War is anyone who wasn't able-bodied enough to fight the next day was considered a casualty. So when you talk about casualties, it's not just the dead. No, 20,000 people were not killed at Shiloh. But casualties includes killed, wounded, missing in action, right? Anyone who can't fight again the next day is not present and accounted for the next day. Massive casualties, though. And just like after First Bull Run, there are field hospitals that were set up all around the battlefield to tend for the wounded and the screaming and the sick and the dying after this battle. A couple years after the Civil War, General Grant wrote his memoirs, wrote his autobiography. And he said something in his memoirs, going back to his time as commander at Shiloh. And I just want to mention this for you to consider. He said that after Shiloh, he decided he was never again going to set foot in a field hospital after a battle. Think about why this would be. If you walk into a field hospital, what are you going to see? Screaming men, amputations, blood, agony, terror. Grant was not callous. Some northern newspapers and politicians said this decision meant he didn't care for his men. If you believe Grant, he said it was the opposite. He didn't want to see this, not because he couldn't take it, not because he was squeamish, far from it. He said to himself, if I go to these hospitals and I see what these battles, what my decisions do to my men, then the next battle, I'll be less aggressive. I'll be more cautious. And the more cautious I am, the longer this war will take. He said, I knew then and there after Shiloh, I had to stay away from these hospitals because it was in the interest of this nation, of both halves of this nation, that this war end as soon as possible. It's not going to win him a lot of fans in the northern newspapers and the politicians. They see Grant as savage, callous, bloodthirsty. But his attitude always would be, and he passed this on to General Sherman too, the more aggressive we are, the sooner the war will end. So hold that thought. But strategically, here's what we got to mention is we're looking at things in the West. You've got Fort Henry and Donelson. You've got a couple rivers that flow to the Mississippi. You now basically, if you're the Union, control almost the entire western portion of the state of Tennessee. And your goal was the Mississippi River, right? Remember Scott's Anaconda Plan. So to go after the Mississippi, Grant's done a lot of the heavy lifting already, to be sure. So let's get us a little closer to control of the Mississippi if we're talking about the North. We don't have to look at everything. Just want to look at a few things. Okay, first of all, no one watching this needs to care one single bit about island number 10. Not one bit. I'm only mentioning it because I want to give you a sense of the scope of the Northern strategy to get this war. You see near the top of the river there is island number 10. Who cares? Okay, yeah, there were 9 other islands nearby. This was the 10th one, okay? There was a Union officer named John Pope, who we will actually see later. Don't worry about him right now. Who took this island. It was a strategic spot for northern access to the Mississippi. Okay, fine. Henry Halleck himself was so worried about the glory that Grant was getting, he took a small group of soldiers and conquered Corinth, Mississippi himself. Got out from behind the desk. Okay, fine. Bottom line, guys, Shiloh, Fort Henry, Fort Donelson, Island number 10, another victory for the North at Memphis. All of these things were really getting Western Tennessee, Western Kentucky in Union hands. The Mississippi River is getting more and more in Union hands. There's 2 other things I want to point out on this map. You see this little square in the bottom. It's called Vicksburg Campaign. Don't worry about that yet. We'll get there later. The other thing you got to look at, though, see New Orleans down here? One of the biggest ports in the country in 1862. If you want to control the Mississippi River, you can't do it without controlling New Orleans, Louisiana. That was the North's next target. And I just want to mention this, how this is going to play out, so we can set the scene for the next time we go back to the Western Theater later on, right? And I mentioned what a huge port New Orleans was. This was still a spot where the Confederacy was trying to bust through that blockade that General Scott's Anaconda Plan had cooked up. So the rebels themselves knew how important New Orleans was. If you know, New Orleans actually sits a few miles up the Mississippi from the Gulf of Mexico. So the Confederates had built a couple of forts right at the mouth of the river to try to keep the Union Navy from being able to get up into the Mississippi to go after New Orleans. The United States Navy brought its full force to the mouth of the Mississippi to try to take out these forts that were defending New Orleans. I don't know if you've ever heard of an admiral in the U.S. Navy named David Farragut, major naval officer for the Union in the Civil War. He's got a lot of things named after him today. The Navy arrived at these forts. that were defending New Orleans downriver at the mouth of the Mississippi. And Farragut was a smart guy. He said, if I take my ships up to these forts head on and try to attack them, well, they're going to have cannons in the forts. They're going to do damage to my ships. They're going to do damage to my men. Farragut was a smart guy. He got a few unmanned rafts, put a bunch of trash on these rafts. The name fire raft is kind of self-explanatory. The Navy, the U.S. Navy, Union Navy, lit a bunch of trash on fire on some rafts and then sent them to float towards these Confederate forts. If there's a manned ship approaching a rebel fort, the rebels in the fort could shoot at the ship, kill the pilot of the ship, and maybe then the ship doesn't hit the fort. An unmanned fire raft can't be stopped. These burning rafts just kept coming and coming no matter what the rebels shot at them. So they catch up to these forts, and as they got closer and the rebels inside the forts realized being able to stop this was fruitless. I don't know if you know what a mutiny is. The Confederates inside these two forts downriver mutinied. They rose up against their officers. They rebelled. They took off. They said, forget it. We're not defending these forts. We don't want to get killed. The forts downriver from New Orleans were abandoned. The Navy under Admiral David Farragut and the Union walked right in or sailed right into New Orleans and conquered the city. New Orleans, like Nashville, Tennessee, would be occupied by the Union for the rest of the war. And we'll go back there. We'll see it later. In fact, I want to mention right now, just foreshadowing something we'll see later. There's a Union general named Benjamin Butler. Oh, what he does is either going to make you laugh or get really angry. We'll see. He's going to control Union-occupied New Orleans for a while. And he is a character. I'll just put it to you that way. But the bottom line, guys, is by April of 1862, almost the entire Mississippi River was already in Union hands. Remember that map I just showed you had that little corner to Vicksburg campaign? There was one city on the Mississippi River still controlled by the Confederates. There was a decent-sized town on the river called Vicksburg, Mississippi. And if you're the Union Army and Navy out west, that's your next target. And we're going to have to see what happens there a little later on. Because for now, I'm going to let you soak up what we've talked about in the Western Theater. Hopefully my webcam stops falling away as I'm doing these videos for you, because that's distracting and I apologize. But hey, that's technology. Keeps it interesting. So that's where we'll leave things for now. Next time we talk, we'll shift gears a little bit. We'll come back to the Western Theater later on. Thanks for watching.